In previous videos, I've discussed author-driven strategies in response to the aftermath of the 1960s and the impact of that decade on theater culture worldwide. I focused on author-driven strategies to describe how playwrights developed strategies, ways of organizing action on the stage in a way that dealt more efficiently and effectively with the resources available to theater after the 1970s and to represent more accurately the experiences of societies and peoples from the 1970s onwards. The author-driven strategies were a way in which authors could maintain their control, you might say, over the theatrical experience and project an artistic identity as a result of being the authors of actions that constituted the motive for going to the theater. So we've read plays by Wallace Shawn, August Wilson, and Amiri Baraka to see how authors had developed strategies or ways of representing human experience in innovative fashion, let's say in ways that weren't contemplated before the 1970s and the decades that followed the 70s. And the author-driven strategy developed across both male and female authors, people writing for musicals, as well as African Americans like August Wilson and Amiri Baraka. And many of these authors are moving away from the realism established by the authors of the 1950s and into the 1960s. And the author-driven strategies remain viable. Plays continue to be produced in great abundance, and many people still aspire to write plays and have them staged. Yet, as I think I made clear in an earlier video, authors no longer command the kind of cultural identity or cultural authority that they projected back in the 1950s with figures like Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams and John Osborne and Harold Pinter and Lorraine Hansberry. We have no dramatist of that stature, and even a playwright like David Mamet seems to have now achieved more significance in relation to film and screenwriting than in relation to the theater. Or at least he claims his authority in that direction himself. So authors no longer hold power in relation to theater performance as once they did. And many persons who want to become writers, authors of performance text find greater opportunities perhaps in writing for television, which seems to be opening so many doors for those who wish to be authors of performances. So why did this happen? Why did the authors lose their once great authority in relation to performance? Well, as I think I also mentioned earlier in the videos about Beck and Grotowski and the 1960s, as a result of so many other things happening outside of the theater, increasing increasing numbers of people began to develop a distrust of language. They did not connect the words that people said with actions that seemed in synchrony with what they were saying. And words had a kind of instability of meaning, which previously they didn't seem to have, but as a result of so much conflict in the world throughout by the middle of the 20th century, it seemed that other ways of communicating were necessary if people were to understand each other or develop some better way of being able to grasp perspectives other than their own, or understand even themselves better than the words they were using to articulate their sense of identity. So it seemed that language was no longer able to represent very accurately the experience of people living in that time and subsequently, since the 60s, 70s. So that distrust of language was a big feature of undermining the authority of authors in the theater. But it was not just that. And by the 70s, theater understood that it had to compete with other media to find audiences, and that the film industry itself had to compete intensely for audiences that television seemed to be drawing away from film. And it became much more difficult for people in any area of the performing arts to attract audiences and claim a portion of an increasingly fragmented society in terms of, at least in terms of entertainment preferences. So theater had to compete much more strenuously and aggressively for audiences, and it wasn't simply a matter of marketing. It was a matter of what's happening on stage to bring audiences to see it. So what made performance more engaging for audiences had to be something that couldn't be satisfied by other media such as film or television or sports or tourism and all kinds of other things that seemed to be rising as people had opportunity and resources to enjoy them. Theater moved toward greater attention, greater emphasis on visual qualities of performance, emphasizing greater power of the body to signify and function as an agent of expressivity. And performance had to rely increasingly on emerging technologies to sustain audience interest. So it was a combination of things that theater employed to make theater a more powerful experience for audiences and a more competitive one. And that emphasis on visual elements, bodily expressivity, and technological interface with performers was a foundation for a different kind of personality to emerge in the theater to guide these elements toward successful embodiment in performance. And that personality was generally not a writer, not an author. And the reason why an author would not be the person who is focused on this more visual, sensory kind of performance is that authors tend to rely primarily on words or language to articulate human experience. And that was a problem with a lot of theater. If we look at some of those plays, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Lorraine Hansberry, and the English writers, Pinter and Osborne, or the German writer Dürrenmatt, and Ionesco and Genet, they are very interested in talk. The action is mostly people talking to each other. It is conversations. And often it isn't so much dialogue as speeches shared with other speech makers in a play. And that kind of action, such as it is, limits the visceral impact of performance, so that if people are going to talk to each other, they need to be fairly stable as bodies in space. They sit down and talk to each other. They talk to each other in places like living rooms or boardrooms or kitchens or hospital rooms or interior spaces, or even in caves or on a desert or on a boat at sea. You have a conversation, you have bodies that are difficult to understand when they're talking if they're not stable in some sense. They're sitting or they're standing. They say something and then maybe walk and sit down, or they sit and then get up, say something and then get up and move to another place and then say something. But the more talk prevails, the more the body remains a stable figure in the performance space. And the longer the performance goes, to achieve some kind of emotional resolution, or let's say emotional justification for listening to all of the language exchanged. And for that reason, conversation is not an economical or an efficient way of generating performance, unless you have actors who have a special gift, which is rare, to be able to sustain the interest, the attention of audiences for long periods of time when they're talking. Because plays with a lot of talk in them tend to be longer, and that requires more charisma or command on the part of actors to sustain the interest. Then perhaps that was not the case in earlier times, when audiences were less demanding of how their time is spent in relation to entertainment, and they put up with a lot of talk. You go back and look at the movies of the 1940s, they talk all throughout, it just goes on, and they talk, and even I get restless watching this stuff, because it seems like the point that's made through talk takes too long to make. But a problem with dialogue in the theater is that not many who are authors, and even the best, such as Arthur Miller or Tennessee Williams or Harold Pinter, who was always very perfunctory in the way he wrote out language for his characters, But most authors are not able, I would say almost all of them, it's just very rare that you have an author who is able to sustain action for a sustained period of time, let's say more than 20 minutes, through dialogue in which the characters are able to exchange language rapidly. One line for one line, or maybe one line, two lines. As the Greeks called it sticomythia. They had a hard time, they used it as a device, but had a hard time sustaining plays through it. But that kind of dialogue tends to be much more driving of action in a play, in creating a more unstable environment and a more unpredictable environment, but it's really, really hard to write, and few are able to do it beyond a page or so, and without that kind of talent for building action out of the rapid exchange of language, it's very difficult for language to maintain its prominence as a motive for attending theater. But very few authors have demonstrated that skill. Very few. It's just, it's an art, you might say, that is missing, and the recovery of it is most likely, from my perspective, with my long experience in relation to theater, from my perspective, authors who are able to regain the control over language in that fashion and be able to set up conflict in language between characters in a very compressed style, so that you have rapid fire exchange of lines. When that happens, that's when the authors are probably going to acquire renewed authority in the theater. But we'll have to wait for that to happen. All right, in my next video, I'm going to talk about the directors who have gained authority in the theater and establish this kind of shift from author-driven to director-driven, and then later on to performer-driven theater culture.